What did we say about Peter last week? Well, we said all sorts of heretical things, but true things. What was Peter not? What was he not? He wasn't a peasant. No. He wasn't a peasant. Where did he live? Where in Galilee? That's correct. Well, where did these partners begin? What was their home city originally? Actually, it wasn't a city at all, it was a village. Where were they from? Bethsaida. Little village. They moved to a bigger place. They moved to the local religious center, the big town. I told you there were about 50,000 people in these towns along the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum was the old religious center. We'll look at the synagogue in Capernaum momentarily. But Peter and Andrew, James and John moved to the religious center, where, as tradesmen, from a family of tradesmen, they would have been given a rabbinic education. In general, the rabbis in the synagogues followed what party line? In general, the rabbis in the synagogues followed what party line? The Pharisees, the very conservative party line. And Peter shows that in his teaching and in the way he handles texts. Peter shows that rabbinic background. Now, the Jews in Judea had a very strong distaste for Galilean Jews. Why? Especially Jerusalem Jews had a strong distaste for Galilean Jews. Why? What would there have been about Galilean Jews that would have made Judean Jews look down on them? No. The Sadducees didn't care about anything. They were Greeks. The upper priesthood, I mean the two families that ruled the country, were Sadducees. Everybody else was Pharisees. And they looked down on Galilean Jews, and I'm asking why. What? They were considered unpolished, yes. But it was something even more than that. Galilee was not strictly Jewish. The capital of Galilee, Sepphoris, was a Greco-Roman city with a large Greek population and a large Roman population. And what did I say last week that was even more shocking about this capital city of Sepphoris? Where was it? Where was it? This great city of Herod Antipater that he was building steadily from 3 BC to 39 AD, in which he had hundreds of thousands of workmen working to build a city that rivaled the cities his father had built. Where was this great city? Who remembers? Don, it used to be 3 miles away. Sepphoris used to be 3 miles from Nazareth. How far is 3 miles? Not far enough. But guess what? They've been excavating Sepphoris, and it's getting bigger. And what's it doing? It's moving closer to Nazareth. It's only 2 miles away now. The city of Sepphoris was on a hill here, right at the crest of a hill. Herod Antipater's palace was a necropolis at the top of the hill. A city, as you look from the ridge of Nazareth, that city is 700 feet below Nazareth. Nazareth is on a ridge. It's the next ridge over, 2 miles away. A city, what? A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. That's right.
It's very influential to the people of Nazareth.
Well, the problem is that the main... Roman cities were set up with a north-south road and an east-west road, the Cardo. And you go out the east gate, and the road runs through Nazareth to Tiberias, the summer capital. The summer capital down on the Sea of Galilee, where they went to swim when it was too hot, and the winter capital at Sepphoris, you had to go through Nazareth. It was on the main road. Now, Herod Antipater, like his father, didn't put the Roman troops right inside the city because that offended the Jews. So he kept them just outside the city, where, you're right, the camp was, you go out the north end of Nazareth, you come to the Roman camp. Now get it. The workmen, the people who built the city, the crews, were living in Nazareth, and the Roman army camp was next door. What kind of a place do you picture? What kind of a place do you picture? It's a military, yes, it's a military town with and a carpenter. The word being artisan, they were building the city. It was under steady building from 3 BC to 39 AD. The entire lifetime of Jesus in Galilee, the city was in rapid construction. Okay. So was Joseph then Joseph was a peasant? No more than Peter and Andrew, James and John. What was he? What was he doing there?
Probably contracting a lot of the work that went on within the city.
See, the Gospel of John says that Herod Antipas's treasurer's wife was Jesus' disciple. Jesus said, Herod, that fox. He said, Herod, that fox. It says that at the trial, Herod was happy to see him because he'd been desired to see him for a long time. The interrelationships are right there. Now, you can make of it what you will. Unfortunately, you can't make Sepphoris go away. It's there. I said before you came in, Kay, it's getting closer because they're excavating it. And as they're excavating it, what are they finding out? It's bigger than they thought. Inside the city, there were at least 30,000 people, and as they expand outward, and they noticed that the city moved along its main east road toward Tiberias, which direction did it go? It went toward Nazareth. So a city that was 3 miles away is only 2 miles away now. Yes. Now, the main road ran out of the capital, over the hills of Nazareth, and down to the Sea of Galilee at Tiberias. And just a couple of miles north of Tiberias was Capernaum, the Jewish religious center, where the fish that went to market in Sepphoris in Jerusalem were being caught. Right? And among the fishermen was this partnership of Peter and Andrew and James and John. Do you know the mother of James and John went to Jesus once and asked that her sons be seated on the right hand and on the left in his kingdom? What would make her do such a thing?
Every mother wants her children to prosper.
A Jewish mother? Yes. It says he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers. You have to understand, this isn't far away. This is on the main road. This is only 16 miles away. This isn't far. This is all the same area. Now, were there peasants in Galilee? We don't want to get the idea that because Herod Antipater was spending millions of dollars a year on building up his army and extending the city, that everybody in Galilee was rich. Were there peasants? What did we read last week? It said that James and John left their father Zebedee in the boat with what? With the servants. With the peasants. How were the peasants paid? Daily. When? At the end of the day. Jesus talked about the landowner sent somebody out in the morning and somebody out at noon and somebody out at 5 o'clock. And at the end of the day, what? He paid them all the same wage. There was a peasant class, and peasants turn up in Jesus' parables. Right? Peasants turn up in Jesus' parables. Was there an agrarian society? Of course. Serving this big city complex that we're describing, from Sepphoris to Tiberias, there was a great agrarian culture. In fact, what does Acts tell us? When Tyre and Sidon fell into a state of war with Antipater, they had to sue for peace. Why, according to Acts? Because they were dependent upon Galilee for their food. It says so, right in Acts. Yeah, so there was a large agrarian culture made up of two classes. Let me explain. In the Roman world, there were first Roman citizens. And then there were freeborn citizens of the local countries that were dominated by the Roman Empire. These freeborn citizens were the people who owned something. Land, a business. And over, best estimates, 90% of the Roman world was what? Was the peasant or slave class that was utterly dependent upon the freeborn for livelihood and life. Well, where was the middle class? Where was the middle class? Yeah, that's right. And what do we do when we read the Bible? What do we automatically do? We read our culture into it and say, it must be so. Right? As soon as we say, and we don't have to argue, as soon as we say that James and John left their father in the boat with the slaves, what do we say? There's no further discussion. What are they not? They're not part of that class, period. Rabbinic education, Peter's questions, Peter's comments, Peter's preaching in Acts shows the stamp of a typical rabbinic education. Right? But there was a problem with Galilean Jews. Yes?
What Acts 4:13 says in the Russian.
Who said that?
Utilize an unschooled ordinary man.
Who Who said that? Who? Yes. Yes. Was there a school that the Sanhedrin approved? Was there a school that the Sanhedrin approved? In fact, there were 2 competing schools. A learned man would have attended one of those schools. As in, who am I thinking of? As in Paul. They wouldn't have said of Paul, he's an educated man. Gamaliel II was his teacher. But somebody from a synagogue education would have been considered what? An ordinary, unlearned. In other words, they were not theologians by profession. See, we're talking about fishermen. Paul would have been what? Although his family was his family of what? Of wealthy Jewish leather workers. Paul would not have worked in leather had he gone on. What would he have been? He would have been a teacher in one of these great schools where he would have received money, tuition for his teaching. None of these people were theologians earning their money from that as a trade. And Paul mentions his continuing his trade even though he's teaching the gospel. Now, what was it about Galilean Jewry that Jerusalem Jewry despised? What I've already said gives you enough information. What? What? Yes, they weren't polished, they weren't theologically sophisticated, but it was worse than that. Who were they associating with if they lived in Galilee? Greeks and Romans. If you associate with Greeks and Romans, what are you? No, you're not a heathen. You're what? You're unclean. A great responsibility of the priesthood was to keep Jerusalem clean and keep the temple from becoming unclean. Because if the temple became unclean, what would happen? The sacrifices offered there would be of no avail. Okay? So there was a great concern about not becoming unclean. The problem with Jesus that came up again and again in the Gospels was what? By his association, he what? He was constant, therefore he was himself what? Unclean, and his disciples were unclean from the Judean viewpoint. Well, they were anyway. They sold their product to the Roman government. Now, of course, those fish were sold in Jerusalem. But what? But the people who produced them were what? Were unclean. You have to think about that. The fish were clean and could be eaten, but the people who produced them were unclean. All right? Jesus was a Galilean. In one of the Gospels, he's referred to as the Galilean. Meaning what? The unclean scum. Okay? This was a derogatory term, the Galilean. Aren't his disciples Galileans? Yeah. Now you would expect in that looser Judaism of Galilee, in those towns from which they came, you'd expect a pretty free-thinking Jew, would you not? But Peter and Andrew, James and John were not free-thinking Jews, were they? Let me ask this question. Why didn't Jesus just go to the theologians and recruit them as his disciples? Just go recruit the theologians who are most sophisticated in all this. Yes. He could barely teach Peter, Andrew, and James, and John anything. Why? Because their rabbinic education at Capernaum had already instilled in them so many traditions and preconceptions that what? Very often after Jesus' public teaching, he got together with his disciples. What were they doing? What kind of questions? Yes, but they weren't just informational questions. What were they? How then? Why then? What is that? What is that? Look, if you say to Jesus, how then do the scribes say so? Why then? What are they doing? In a nice way. They are objecting. Right? Much of the discussion in the Gospels of the disciples with Jesus were objections to what he had taught, based on their prior conceptions. They had tradition in their mind, and Jesus was going against it. Does that ever happen today? No? Yeah, I think that happens today. Now, at least their education was sufficient to help them know the issues, but not so deep that it was hopeless to teach them anything new. Right? So they were in that interim stage. Yeah. Now, you would expect of a fisherman from Galilee, you would expect a free-thinking Jew, but they weren't. You would expect perhaps one who didn't pay too much attention to the tradition that was so highly prized in Jerusalem. What do you say in relation to that about Peter? Was he a free-thinking Galilean who didn't pay too much attention to the tradition? So prized in Judea? Well, he said what I was going to say. It took the theologian who had been steeped in it and who had rejected the whole thing utterly to tell Peter, when the Jewish Christians arrived from Jerusalem and they got that scowl on their face when they saw that Peter was what? Eating with Gentile Christians. What did Peter stop doing? He stopped eating with Gentile Christians. He immediately succumbed to his rabbinic background. Except that there was a trained theologian there who'd rejected the whole system. Who was that? Paul. Who, with his usual subtlety and diplomacy, did what? Yeah. Look, can I say this nicely? Paul wasn't appreciated in his own day. Right? If you say a prophet is without honor in his own country, the whole world was Paul's country. Paul was too direct. And when this happened, what did he do? He tells us he withstood Peter to his face publicly. Now that was quite a thing. But now, not only did Peter revert to type almost immediately without thinking about it, but something happened that revealed how deeply Peter was a conservative Jew. Acts 10. This is amazing. This story is amazing. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohorti, a devout man who feared God with all his household, Now this is a technical term. We've got to watch out when you're reading a narrative that you miss a technical term. When it says he was a devout man who feared God, what does it mean? Who were the God-fearers? They are mentioned again and again in the book of Acts. Who were the God-fearers? What is it a technical term for? He's an Italian, but he's a devout man who feared God. What does that mean? He was an Italian, what? Proselyte. He was an Italian convert to Judaism. Okay? Do you have it here? This was an Italian convert to Judaism. He was a God-fearer. Now, did you remember they had a synagogue of the God-fearers? They made a synagogue for these foreigners so that they could worship together as Jews, but not associate with Jews themselves. Okay. Who feared God with all his household. That's quite a statement. Feared God with all his household. Meaning what? A centurion's household was what? His wife, his children, his what? His slaves. He gave alms liberally to the people and prayed constantly to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision, this is the time of the evening sacrifice, an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? He said to him, Your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God, and now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. Simon called Peter. This appears again and again in the Gospels. Simon called Peter. Instead of saying Simon Peter, they say Simon called Peter. We're going to talk about that momentarily. He is lodging with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the seaside. And while I'm about it, was Simon the tanner, whose house was by the seaside, another one of these peasants? What? Simon the tanner means what? Yes. Yes, he's one of those freeborn people who doubtless had his slaves and so forth. Yes. Yes. So he was, by definition, not a peasant. He's lodging with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the seaside. When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier. A devout soldier meaning what? Servant is such a nice translation for the word slave. It's so pleasant. He called 2 of his slaves and a soldier who was what? Meaning what? He was also a convert to Judaism. Okay? Now these slaves by definition were Jews because they were part of Cornelius' household. And a soldier from among those who waited on him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. The next day as they were on their journey and coming near the city, Peter was on the housetop, went up to the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. He became hungry, okay, it's noontime, and desired something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance, and saw the heaven opened, and something descended like a great sheet let down by 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals, and reptiles, and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Aha. We haven't seen this in a while. What do we do? Yeah. Let's start on this side, then take it over there. Red is, stops here. Green goes to the mission field. Verse 13. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, verse 14, this is the key. But Peter said, Peter's not a youth here. He's not a young man. He is a Galilean Jew. He's worked in Galilee most of his life. But Peter said, No, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. Now I'm sure that Peter doesn't see himself in vision saying something that isn't true of himself or that isn't his basic personality. He speaks in the vision just as he is. And what does he say? First of all, what's fascinating is the voice comes from heaven, and what does he say? No, Lord. Well, that's one way to respond to a heavenly order. Absolutely not. Because what? I've never eaten anything common or unclean. Now, Peter's attitude toward the food, we find out in this vision, is what? What? Yes, it's repulsive. But Peter's attitude toward the food, unclean is unclean is unclean. It's a category. Besides food, what else? There were people that were unclean. And what do we discover? Peter what? Wants to have, well, this is after the resurrection. Peter wants to have what? Nothing to do with it. And says, I've never eaten anything common or unclean. Now then. No. That's my point. A typical Galilean Jew was constantly being berated by the Judean Jews for being so liberal that they didn't care about this sort of thing. Oh yes. Those pigs that went over the cliff, the Gadarene swine, were owned by Jews. And from Peter's viewpoint, as an ultra-conservative Jew, what would he have felt when the pigs went over the cliff? Good ins! That was a good one. Yes. Okay, why do you think Peter was the one who was called to Cornelius' house? Verse 15. And the voice came to him again a second time, what God has cleansed you must not call common. This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what this vision which he had seen might mean, he's wondering what it means. It's obvious that it can't mean what? It can't mean you can eat those things. He doesn't even consider that as an option. He doesn't even consider that as an option. What does it mean? Behold, the men that were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood before the gate, and called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. While Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, Behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. And Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming? What would you call that as a greeting? He doesn't say, oh, God just told me you were here. He says what? I'm the one you're looking for. What's your reason for being here?
Why they were coming, only that they were coming. So now he's curious and wants to know, why are you really here?
What has not occurred to him, and what is he not doing with open arms?
It hasn't occurred to him that they are to be conquered.
He's got some Roman slaves and a Roman soldier, all of them Jews, but what? They're still what?
Still Romans.
They're still Romans. All right. They said Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and hear what you have to say. So he called them in to be his guests. That's a big line. He called them in to be his guests. I hope Simon the tanner was able to go along with this. The next day, he rose and went off with them, and some of the brethren from Joppa accompanied him. On the following day, they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his kinsmen and close friends. Okay, so now Cornelius has a big company waiting, and Peter didn't go alone. What? He went with a group of people. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. And Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." And as he talked with him, he went in and found many persons gathered. He said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then why you sent for me." Okay. Who was Peter?
Back up a minute.
Yeah. The clean and unclean business was a health rule that had been extended into an ethical norm that people by definition are evil, which was a way big extension from, or that certain animals are evil. There's nothing wrong with a pig. Pigs were wonderful. They should have kept them. And in the early period, they did keep them. What were they good for? They were good for keeping things clean. We would say that a garbage can is unclean. And we would say that you wouldn't eat from it, right? But would we say a garbage can is evil? And that we must not associate with garbage cans? Well, every Tuesday I have to associate with my garbage cans. And there's nothing bad about it. Am I better off or worse off because I've got my garbage cans? I'm better off. But by Jesus' day, only wicked Jews had pigs. Yes, garbage cans. You wouldn't find one in Judea. That had happened centuries earlier after the Babylonian exile. You remember what Antiochus Epiphanes did? To end the Jewish religion? He sacrificed a pig on the altar. Let's go back to the beginning. John 1. What did Jesus say to Peter the first time he ever saw him face to face? What was Peter's statement to Jesus the first time he saw him, and where was that? Where was Jesus' first meeting with Peter, and what did he say? It was after John told his closest disciples that Jesus was the Messiah, and Andrew went and got his brother Peter. And John 1 and verse 42, he brought him to Jesus. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "No, so you are Simon Bar-Jonah. You shall be called Sepphoris." Jesus is speaking to him in Aramaic, which means Peter, which means what? Stone or rock. Jesus, I don't care what you prefer, Jesus called him stone or rock first time he ever laid eyes on him. And Simon was thereafter called what? We see them speaking in the Gospels, and he's addressed as Cephas sometimes. He's Simon called Peter. He was thereafter called what? Simon called Peter. So how was he called thereafter? He was called Peter, meaning what? Rock. Jesus gave him that name the first time he ever laid eyes on him. Why? Yes. No, same word. Yep. Matthew 16. Kay said this is the proof text of Roman Catholicism, right? So it is. This is the basic appeal of Roman Catholicism. Matthew 16. Verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" They said, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, see, the word is already used, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And he answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John," the way he spoke to him the first time he ever saw him. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Interestingly. Well, what about it?
Well, I think when you look at the word "this," Christ is talking, he wasn't talking about you. He says, "This rock."
Well, that's one interpretation. I tell you, you are a rock, and on this rock I'll build my church. That's one interpretation, that Jesus was saying, you're a rock, but I'm the rock. That's one interpretation. A second interpretation is that the rock was the statement of Peter. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the second interpretation. The third interpretation is that you are a rock, and on this rock I'll build my church, meaning Peter. Okay? There are three interpretations. That the rock was Christ, that the rock was Peter, or that the rock was the statement Peter had made. Now we can say at least this, that Jesus saying, "You're a rock, and on this rock I'll build my church," would certainly lead to potential confusion, would it not? If you call someone rock from the very first time you meet him, the day you meet him you say, "You're going to be called rock," and then you make the statement to this person a long time later, "You're a rock, and on this rock I'll build my church," that at least leaves open the possibility that you meant what? That person. Okay? Yes. Now, did Jesus mean the statement that Peter had made? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Did he mean Peter was the rock? Or did he mean he was the rock? Which of the three interpretations do you favor? Well, don't say Jesus. Let's do some exegesis here. No. Your understanding should be the biblical understanding. Where the Old Testament describes the Messianic king as the rock that was rejected. Let's do it right. Now, that's true. So there's a background, you're saying. There's a background to the word. There's a background to the use of the word, a biblical background that has to be considered. That's good. That's it. Number 1 point. What else?
Why did he call Peter the rock?
Good question. That's what I wanted to get to. Why did he call Peter the rock in the first place? And call him the rock, not here, but from the first time he ever laid eyes on him. Yes?
I've heard it said that the term rock that he used for Peter was more like a pebble.
Yeah, I understand. That's an interpretation of what Jesus said. There's nothing in the language that you can use to prove that. The difference between masculine, feminine, and neuter is a foolish distinction as far as I'm concerned. There's nothing in the language. It's clear that Jesus, in a variety of contexts, called Peter a rock.
I think you have to look at the context of this. When Christ was speaking this rock, who did he mean this for? I think he was talking about himself, Peter.
Okay.
This rock.
Look, here's the thing. If you're a Roman Catholic, this rock is Peter. If you're most Protestants, that this rock is what? Jesus himself. Or Jesus' statement about himself. Okay? See, you either put the weight down on Peter or on Jesus.
On what basis?
Well, she just brought up one basis. Prior use of the term in the Bible. Well, describing the Messianic King. Was Peter the leader of the apostles in any sense? Oh yeah, there's no question about that. If you were to say, who was Jesus' right-hand man? Who would it be? You'd have to say Peter. No amount of trying to maneuver around Roman Catholicism can hide the fact that it's Peter and the apostles. Right? At the resurrection, what? No, it doesn't say go tell the disciples and Peter. Go tell Peter and the disciples. Took the wrong corner right at the last minute there. Go tell Peter and the apostles that he's risen. Peter stood up and said, we've got to get a 12th person here. Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and said, as David says, and David being a prophet, and taught as a rabbi would teach. Indicted by the Holy Spirit, yes. But the Holy Spirit doesn't give people something, what? That they never had. The Holy Spirit calls to mind and puts together what? What you already have. Peter already had it. And he spoke as a religious teacher with great knowledge and skill and ease. And he was very gracious. He was a diplomat. What did he say when he was under being arrested? He said, now, this man whom you hanged on a tree, and I know that you and the leaders of the people did it from ignorance and didn't know or intend to do what you did. Right? He speaks as a diplomat. Right? Paul founded these churches in Galatia that this epistle is to. Paul founded the church at Corinth, and it was divided hopelessly. And who went there to calm things down and put them back together? Who writes so graciously to these people here? Peter, yes. We treasure the letters to the Corinthians that Paul wrote. And we preach from them because when the church is in disarray, Paul's giving you plenty of ammunition to set people right. But Peter went and what? With his skill as a leader of people, with his natural charisma, and with his authority as what? With his known authority that's alluded to constantly in the Gospels as the chief of the apostles, he came and what? Settled the problem. Yes. I asked, look, something happened that was of great significance. Judaism was split between the Essenes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and now another sect developed within Judaism. They were first called Christians at Antioch outside of they were called Messianists in Judaism. So now there was another sect. And how many Essenes are there today? None. How many Pharisees have you met? I mean actual members of the Pharisee party. None. How many Sadducees are there? None. Had Judaism contained Messianism, and had it always been a sect of Judaism, what would have happened? It would have fallen with Judaism. But there came a day in the history of the world, to everybody's shock, including Peter, when Peter did what? He entered a Gentile house and preached the gospel, and the Holy Spirit fell on his listeners. to everybody's shock, including Peter. And when he went to Jerusalem, what did the brethren make him do? They wanted an explanation immediately for what they had heard, that Peter had preached the gospel to Gentiles in a Gentile house. He was in trouble. And what did he say? He told about the vision. He recounts the vision almost word for word, as is recorded in Acts. And he told them there was nothing else I could do, or I would have been fighting against God. And furthermore, the Holy Spirit came on them. And so it says they were satisfied. That moment changed history. Because what? That was the day what? That Christianity ceased being a Jewish sect and started on the track to become a world religion. The greatest and largest world religion of history. That was the moment that changed history, that created Western history, that set the world on the track that it was never going to retreat from. And who did that? Peter. And why was Peter the one chosen for that vision? Because I'll tell you, those brethren, what? If anybody else had done this, what would have happened? There'd have been two Christianities, right? The real Jewish one and what? The unacceptable, unclean Gentile one. But Peter, because of who he was, could go to a Gentile house and preach the gospel and what? And people were horrified, but what? They accepted it because it was Peter. That tells you something about Peter, doesn't it? Both his natural gifts and his position in the church. Did Jesus ever pun? Did Jesus ever pun? Did he ever speak in double entendres? Did he ever say anything meaning more than one thing? All the time. All the time Jesus was given to making statements with multiple meanings. In fact, it was one of the accepted methods of teaching in the first century. It was one of the centuries-old acceptable rabbinic methods to say something that meant more than one thing. When Peter said, "You are a rock, and on this rock I'll build my church," what was he saying? By saying, being the first human being to say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Peter had what? Yes, he made more than the right statement. He was the first human being to say it. What? He was the first person to state the gospel. He had elected himself as what? By his nature, by his personality, by his background, by his gifts. It was more than a year before Jesus chose his disciples after his public ministry. How did these men get chosen? What were they doing during that year? What? They were following, listening, evaluating, and responding. They elected themselves, and Peter elected himself. And so in the epistle, he moves from his authority to what? To the authority of Christ as the living stone. Yes? Well, I'm sure that stabilized over time.
I heard a sermon one time that said that Christ recognized in Peter a gift that was beyond all measure. In other words, he was capable, even with all his faults, of great work in the gospel. And this is what we're actually saying.
Well, in his own day, looking at it from the centuries later, who was the most influential of the apostles? From our perspective today, centuries later, who's been the most influential? John? Oh, I don't think so. Paul. There's no question that over the centuries, Paul has shaped Christianity. But in his own day, Peter had to sort of protect and apologize for Paul. In his own day, who was the great leader? Peter was. Yes. Yes, again, people are indicted by the Holy Spirit from their own gifts and their own choices. That's a great lesson. Yes, Jesus meant Peter was a rock that he would build his church on, and he also meant what? That he himself was the greater rock. Jesus was punning, you see. He meant to lead their minds along, gradually. And it's no surprise that in the epistle, we find Peter doing that very thing. Wonderful, huh?